This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Tony Cragg. Known for his dynamic, often swirling forms that push the boundaries of material and movement, Cragg's work is a testament to the endless possibilities of sculpture. His innovative use of materials, including bronze, steel, plywood, glass, and a variety of synthetic compounds, allows him to explore and express complex forms that make reference to nature, science, and the intrinsic properties of the objects that surround us. The conversation touches on a variety of topics, including process, materials, and inspirations. And now, a conversation about the continuous pursuit of shape and form with sculptor Tony Cragg. Tony Cragg, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Tony, I wanted to speak with you because you have a show coming up here at the end of April 27th to June 29th at Marion Goodman Gallery in Los Angeles. But Tony, a lot of times when I speak with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, let's say you're seated at a dinner party next to someone who has absolutely no idea who Tony Cragg is or the nature of your work. Where do you begin to explain to them what it is?
Okay, well, it happens often enough, but I'm not really sure I've got a pat answer for it. I mean, it's easier for me because, people say what you do. It's very rare, actually. I know nowadays a lot of people go, oh, I'm an artist. And I find that's a very difficult answer. So I just say I'm a sculptor. And they obviously say, so what does that mean? And I just say, well, I make a lot of work. I've made a lot of work over the last 50 odd years. And that is not... I'm not a sculptor that copies something. I don't copy bits of reality. I don't copy what a human being looks like or make a horse out of bronze or something like that. I just look at material and move it around and to see what kind of ideas I can generate while I'm doing that and what kind of emotions I get out of just moving the material around. And I can say that very genuinely because I think that's really, it was a long time when I was a younger person. It was a long time that I didn't really think of myself as being a sculptor. I just had that idea. Just moving the material around was a sufficient way for me to work. Yeah, and still is.
Well, I mean, your early work was strictly moving materials around, these sort of assemblages that were constructed. But there's a point where your work moved from, the assemblage of collected things to something where you were using materials to transform, into unique forms, right?
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that transition?
Yeah, I think that, I went to art school in 1969, and I can genuinely say I was just interested in drawing. It was something I'd started to do as a hobby, as a 19-year-old person, 20-year-old person. And I just had the idea to go to art school to learn a little bit about drawing and it was one of those very academic standard courses, but it was, 1969 was not the most uninteresting periods of time to be in an art school in. And they said part of the course, next week you'll be making sculpture. And I thought, oh, make sculpture. That's not what I came here for. So, so Monday morning we started to make with just loads of material something. And, I just found it just amazing, just to see with every change of form and profile and surface, different ideas, different emotions coming together. And it was really, in the speed that it happened, it just really, really surprised me. But I was a poor student. I didn't have any financial support, so I just had to work for my studies and the materials. And it was the time of, let's say, in a way, the ready-made. I mean, a lot of art movements after the Second World War were based on, if you like, the ready-made principle. whether it was pop art or arty pauvre or landscape art, all those kind of things. It was dealing with what was there, what one found. And so I just started to make work with stuff that was around me. And that was, and I've always been interested in geology and kind of structures in that one finds in nature. So what I did is with man-made materials, I just kind of built them up, stacked them up, or spread them around to actually make things that felt like they were almost natural. I mean, geological structures or whatever. And then I was lucky. I was very lucky in life, and I could work could study in the Royal College, and we actually shared the backyard with the Natural Museum and the Geological Museum. So I spent most of my time actually in those museums. I mean, I didn't go to lectures or anything, but I just thought that was really what I learned so much in those buildings. And then in that time, it was just collecting material in the different places in and around Kensington, where I was, where the university was. And then I came to Germany in 1977, and the first opportunities, that I took to do exhibitions was really just with like the material around me, was the stuff I found. And once I did start, I mean, I really got into it, and I was going places and finding new materials, getting new ideas, and building stuff very quickly. So it was really an installation situation, almost a performance in a way. And that went on really rapidly for 2 or 3 years into the early 80s. I spent a lot of time making stuff and moving places, sometimes even making almost like 10 exhibitions a year. I think it was one year. It was exhausting. But increasingly, I had the idea, but if you keep going on that, you rely on a kind of repertoire, if you like, of how to do it, how to do things. And it became less and less what I was interested in. And also looking at the stuff I've been using, I started to realize, but there's a lot more that I can actually do with this if I go back into the studio, start working with the form that this sort of place to start, this found material, but to work from there and make things. So I literally went back to my studio in 1983, 84, and along with still making lots of kind of works that still related to the material I found, but starting to actually make forms, to mold forms. And for me, it was an enormous, I kind of missed out learning that when I was in art school. I kind of somehow avoided that. So it was an enormous, I suppose you call it a learning curve I had to go through to actually find out how to do it. So I mean, and I was very lucky, fortunate. I had a couple of really good assistants that helped me through that, so that was that transition. I mean, I'd been working with plastic stuff I'd found, and then after I realized looking at it, I mean, it was also just the color, which was very just primary colors and nothing, no secondary, no tertiary colors, no tonal ranges, no grays. So it was very, very limited in its color, but also the form. And I'm looking at a pile of plastic material, and I just thought, this is all totally simple geometries, which is logical because industry makes things as quickly and cheaply as possible. So they use industrial systems that just churn it out as quickly and simply. But it is a kind of enormous reduction of the possibilities of form. There's basically a lot of things are just modified cylinders, straight-edged, flat surfaces, boring as hell. And so I started to think about how to work away from this kind of impoverishment of form and to make richer and stronger forms. And not so much about, again, not to start to make things realistically, but to show what's not there. So I literally used to take two objects and kind of hybridize them, working in the space between them. And so that was really the first few things. In a while, I was actually really keen on making things without them being there, just the shadow they cast. And I was just making the shadow in black wax. And they were very unsuccessful works, not very good at all. But I mean, that was the kind of where I got started into really making things.
Well, it makes me think. I remember taking an anthropology course, and the instructor talking about how native cultures really don't know how to respond to right angles because in nature, there really aren't right angles. And I think that's something we maybe haven't seen a 90-degree angle in your work in quite some time, maybe 30 or 40 years, right?
That's possibly right. I think when I was in the late 60s, early 70s, I was absolutely amazed. I was by minimal art. I was obsessed by minimal art. I thought Don Judd, Don Flavin, all of these people, Carl Andre, maybe extending a little bit into land art, like people like Richard Long, somehow the attitude seemed right, and it was really. I love that work because what I felt it did is that there was no message in it. There was no sort of literary. The references were reduced, and it left one an enormous possibility to find out what one had in one's own mind. What does that mean to you? How does that feel? And I found that. But I realized, despite this admiration, as an early 20, 22, 23-year-old person, this admiration for these artists, I realized I wasn't that generation. And the first stacks I built were really, they were cute. They were rectangular blocks, but they were just made in materials that almost just refused to be made into straight lines, hard edge forms. And so that's yes, that it is true. Your comparison to maybe nature or more natural materials in nature, you don't find the simple geometries. And I always say this, and I always apologize for repeating myself, but I do feel our industrial systems are responsible in the way we make stuff does result in an enormous impoverishment of the form around us. And so I think sculpture is probably one way. There are very few things that actually provide new forms, and providing new forms is very difficult, very, very important for me, because new form means a new idea, a new emotion, and a new part of language, maybe, and definitely, yeah, some new freedom. So that's how I see that relationship.
Your work has a quality that's kind of hard to put one's finger on, and there is this sense of like geological layering and natural processes of erosion. But sometimes when I look at your work, there's also seems to be a sense of like digital glitching. Is that just me and how I've been conditioned in this 21st century, or is that something that's actually an input for you?
Well, I think the thing is that if you don't copy something in the world, like whether it's as I said, the human figure or even boxes, and then you have to have a reason to make things. You don't have a picture in front of you. I'm going there. So my whole kind of thing is simply looking into a mass of material to find out at what point something has a meaning for me, affects me emotionally. And I think, I forgive me, I say the same examples. If you take a lump of clay and you start playing with it, and you're into millions and billions and perhaps infinite number of different forms that you could do with it, and so, but not some of it's just dust on your fingers. It's nothing. But finally, if you're not just trying to model a person out of it, or a bird, or a tree, or something, if you're just looking at, sometimes some things start to sort of mean something to you, strangely enough. They start to affect you. And that is really all I do in the studio, really, is I'm looking at the enormous possibilities that are in front of me, and I'm just sifting them down to suddenly something. It's like tuning in an instrument where you suddenly think, oh, well, after all that, this is actually vibrating on the C note or something. You just get it to a point where it starts to work for you, and that's all I'm doing, really.
Can we talk a little bit about scale? Because my impression is you work with polystyrene, with your team, and a lot of these forms, get turned in. I know your process probably varies from, stacking plywood and certain pieces to working with polystyrene. Is everything in your working process at full scale, or do you work in maquettes and scale up?
Well, I mean, to just start to make I mean, you say polystyrene. We very rarely use polystyrene, but we use polyurethane, which is a slightly more substantial
Okay.
material, good for poly. And the point of that is, in a way, I mean, you have to consider this. I mean, Henry Moore didn't make before the 50s. He did make a sculpture that was higher than 2 meters. It's very, very difficult to make a big sculpture, to be honest. Sounds a bit glib when I say that, but I mean, and um, and it was really into the 50s and 60s that artists, and it was two very unlikely friends, Jean de Buffet and Klaus Oldenburg, were some of the first artists to use these light materials like polystyrene, because then you can make enormous volumes. They're not made of plaster and chicken wire and all those complicated structures that as soon as you move them crumble and break. And so that's been available. That material has been available. But to be honest, the way I'm actually doing stuff is I can only draw. Everything starts with some drawing I'm doing, something I'm just doodling or drawing, and to arrive at some beginning of something, and then I'll try to make it in some smaller form. I mean, just maybe like uh, biggest half a meter or a meter high or something. I mean, just manageable, pick it up, turn it round, play with it, and do stuff to it. Change it as much as I need to change until I find something I'm interested in. So that's really, if that starts to work, then I want to see, how it goes on. So I'll make a bigger version, maybe up to a couple of meters high, 6 foot high or something. And after that, then if it really starts to become interesting for me and relevant, because not everything is relevant to make big, then I can go for bigger scale if I feel it's really going to be necessary. Yeah.
Sure.
So it's not small.
I spoke to William Kentridge last year, and we were speaking about the importance of play in his process. And he talks about the beginnings of his works come from an uninhibited exploration with no expectations. And then as it progresses, he allows himself to step back and kind of have a critical eye. Is all of that play in your work in the drawing process?
Not really. I don't really know very much about Kentridge's work, and I'm happy to. And I never thought we'd have any kind of things that we share in the working process. But I do understand if that's how he works. I understand it very, very well. And I think as long as I can just draw and make smaller sculptures, then I can. Then there's a lot of play. It's a lot of improvisation and thinking I'm doing something grand in the evening and coming in the morning and thinking, oh God, what the hell did I do last night? It was terrible. But that thing I chopped off and threw away, that looks interesting. So start with that, So you sort of, I feel playful. It's also some bit irritating sometimes, but it's open ended. At least that. Getting bigger making bigger works will tend to reduce that playfulness without a doubt, just because of the practicalities of the situation. But there are works. I have a series of works I called Lost in Thought, which is where I really do make them big right from the beginning, but they take a year and more to finish. So that's the answer. If you're going to play big, it'll take a very long time. Yeah.
I've heard you say that you have no ideas, that 90% of your work is just in response to what you made last. Can you talk about the serial nature of your work and how that leads to its evolution? I mean, if you finish a work and you look at it critically and you think this is the origin for what's coming next, is there a part in the process, like 60 or 70% of the way through, where you could have taken a divergent path? Do you back up to that point and examine that alternate path? What does that part of your process look like?
Oh, well, there are two aspects. I mean, it's a nice sort of quick answer saying I don't have ideas, just because I don't really like good idea art. I mean, that's what I think. But so I try to work it out of the material itself. But it's true, when you do make a work, I mean, it is a chain of decisions. I mean, maybe hundreds, it could have been thousands of little decisions about whether you, I mean, if you're doing a drawing or you're doing a painting and modeling something, your hands are moving, your brain is moving, everything is up for grabs. So there is a lot of, but then you do have moments on that chain of decision making where you have big moments where you think, wow, go that way and the work has two heads and to go that way has none at all. So you can, but so it doesn't have to be that dramatic, by the way, but you can remember on when the work is finished, you think, so I've made a sculpture that has one head. Fine. But if I'd have gone this way, it would have been different, you know? So, I mean, so you become aware of these options. One, it's like the path not taken or the path taken. I mean, you can only do one thing in the process of making a work in the end, ultimately. But what's left over is these options of, come included in that, in the way I work. I just got, had to take a reckoning of what I'm doing recently. And I found out that I'm making actually 35 sculptures at the moment, Some of them I've been working on for 4 years, and they probably will never, ever come to any result that I'm interested in, disparagingly enough. And then other things just come very, very rapidly. That, oh, wow, I just thought about that a few weeks ago, 3 months ago, did the drawings, made small works, and it's going on very fast. So, and a lot of these sculptures actually belong to different kinds of, you say serial, no, but a series of works, different things. So there's a possibility of not just the linear, but you can also do a crossover. What you've learned in the making of one sort of kind of work suddenly finds an application in something that I didn't kind of, think of. When I say, it's just that I'm not capable of thinking it through. I have to make it through. I don't know how to think that through. I have to experience it.
You work in a variety of materials. Does the material influence what form you make out of a particular material? Because the different materials have different qualities, or is your choice of material really about what the surface is going to reflect in the end? How do you choose what material? Because we're talking about glass, plywood, fiberglass, steel. I think there's even some bronze, right? I mean, I think I saw at least one stone work. You don't do much stone, do you?
Oh, actually, we do quite a lot. But I mean, stone may be an exceptional situation. But no, I mean, look at the room you're sitting in. You'll probably look around. You've got about 200 different materials in that room, with all doing completely different shades. Your lampshade looks totally different from the surface of your table, and the shirt you're wearing looks different from the computer. So we're surrounded materials. So there's an enormous amount of material one can use. And the kind of like Duchampian ready-made thing that we've learned at the beginning of the 20th century has enabled us. We know we're not just limited to, I don't know, a dozen materials that we can use to make, stuff out of. So that's not the point. The point now is really the whole material world has become, sculpture is about looking at, I'm not going to say investigating, but looking at and trying to find meaning in the whole material world. So I think it's very important, that aspect, because, I mean, we think science is the big maker of stuff. It is. Science sort of does all of the work in inventing, discovering the principles of our reality and the laws behind it. But what does that all mean to us? And it's really only through the arts that you actually get to know what the meaning of stuff is. Sometimes you're really surprised. They tell you how old the universe is, or how big it is, or something, or how many molecules you have in your body, and you think, oh, really? I mean, but how it doesn't, somehow it's impressive, but it doesn't mean that, doesn't alter much of my life, So looking at materials, I mean, we literally know now you can make a sculpture out of DNA, blood, chocolate, you name it, it's probably been done, so that's the point. But it is true that materials have their own range of expression in them. They're like instruments in an orchestra. You know what you can expect from the trumpet, and you know what you can get out of the violin. They have those. So you can't use, if you want to use bronze, then you can make fantastically complicated polymorphic forms. but they're not the strongest. They don't have enormously strong tensile strength, you know. But on the other hand, steel does. But steel is then at a much higher melting point, very turgid, very strong, stable, style, steel. That's what it means. It means strength. The word itself means strength. And it therefore is very strong, but as a metal, it's very turgid at a very high. So you can't make very polymorphic forms with it, or you could try unless you find a way of doing it. I mean, that's something I've been in my work in the last few years, as I've been really interested to do, is kind of stretch the possibilities of, you know, if you look at the history of steel sculpture, starts with Tatlin, with structural, you know, I-beams and steam plates, the stuff that they made the Eiffel Tower out of, and the railway bridges, and then. And that goes on into history. It goes on to Anthony Caro and Marc de Souber and Sarah and etc. and Chile, all of those people. But you can see the industrial format that is at the back of the material they use. It's industrially formatted material. So I find ways of kind of getting across that. I'll make the work in polyurethane that I can deal with quite easily in terms of carving and cutting and polishing, and then I'll make it in, and I'll cast it in steel, I'm making a work that has an incredibly sort of more static dynamic about it. I mean, that's so. But there is those two metals, but you can't do you know, if you use bronze and steel, but also if you use wood. All of these wooden sculptures I make, I use plywood, quite thick plywood, but the plywood allows me to, it's layered, so I can build it up on top of each other and keep changing for as long as I want to. I can take it down. So suddenly, what's normal about making sculptures is either additive, you know, with clay and plaster, or it's subtractive in that you bang, you know, take the stone and the wood and you chip it away. But with using this plywood, this ship, I can build it up and then if I don't get what I want, I can take it down again, you know. But it makes it a little bit like everything else. I mean, you're a writer, you know, so you know when you're writing, you write this, no, not that word, no, change the word around. And you're doing, or you listen to somebody composing music, da 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 da, la da 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 da, la la da da, and that so you hear people arranging the material. You know, for me, music's only material, everything's material. So you just hear them arranging the material in their mind and in the air, and then suddenly they get their form right. And for me, there's no difference in that. That's how I see the material.
Last year, I had the person who's the head of painting at MoMA on to talk about a Matisse exhibit that she put together regarding his Red Studio. It was a painting that captured his studio, and part of that conversation was about a particular painting that was on the wall of his studio that showed up in photos. It showed up in the painting of a studio. It was always there for years, and at the end of his life, he had his son destroy it on his deathbed.
Oh.
You know, part of the conversation is there was something about this painting that was an inspiration to him. It was a painting that unlocked something in his process, and that he wanted as a reminder in his working process. And I guess my question is there something in your studio that you take inspiration from? And B, was there a particular piece that you made that you felt unlocked, you know, a new direction in your work?
Okay, good question. I mean, I recently thought about something. When I was, my father was an engineer. We had lots of different jobs in different places. So I went to 7 schools. We were always moving around. And when I was quite young, I think 8 years old, we arrived in a place called Wellinghurst. It's north of London. And it was an interesting area because it was a moraine. It was the Ice Age had come down there, and there were lots of little slightly hilly, gravelly hills. And my brother and I, we were given the task of making a path out of gravel. And we were just collecting buckets of gravel and then putting it down. And then something came out of the bucket. And it was this amazingly beautiful object. It was only maybe not even 3 inches, 2.5 inches long. And we both grabbed to grab it. My brother actually got it first, but as his older brother, of course, I had to take it off him. And so we had this, and we looked at it and we thought this is a very valuable object that obviously someone must have dropped, because it looks so perfect and so beautiful. And we took it in later. Before we went to bed, we thought, well, we'd better ask our dad what that is. So we took it to him and we showed him, and he said, "Oh, it's an echinoid. It's a fossilized sea urchin." He said, and we said, "But where's it come from?" Well, there used to be an ocean here, an ocean, and there used to be an ocean here, and this was, and then there was the ice age, and the ice here there used to be like a kilometer of ice on top of this area, and the ice has pushed out of the ocean, has pushed this living creature that lived there like 300 million years ago. So this one little object just opened up. I mean, I didn't think about this as a child, but later on I realized a tiny thing is a portal to so many ideas and concepts and emotions. I mean, both my brother and I, we couldn't sleep that night because the idea we were under an ocean, we'd been through an ice age and creatures that don't exist nowadays. These were several new worlds for us. And so there are things. This fossil is next to my bed, and it will always be there as long as I'm alive. It's not an artwork. It's just something we found when we were little boys, but it's the reminder of how art works and how things work. I can give you a cup, and it's a cup, but I can say this is the cup that Christ drank out of. And suddenly this association, you transform that thing with just changing the terms around it, the information, the associations you give it. If you make the thing originally, it's not even a cup, it's something you made yourself, and then you give it more language. Those things become incredibly complicated, and that's what artists do, and that's what we're all working out on some level or other. So that's in terms of my own making. I think the first thing I ever made was, I can't remember what it was a shock to me, because just the idea of like moving the material around and having that experience was a door opener, an opener to my world. And 55 years ago. And then I think finding out about all of the art movements that happened at that period of time in England, there was Henry Moore, there was Anthony Caro, there was Richard Long, Gilbert and George, three generations of artists. For a young person, it seemed like an incredibly dynamic kind of situation, and also just the way they discuss things or went at each other. You realize, well, this is about something important. It's not just about making interesting things. It was really important. And so the work I made then started with the first things were things that I really felt very, very strongly about, and I was amazed to find my own way in them. The making the first stacks in the middle of 1974 was a big step for me. The first works I made in plastic were like new material, more or less, which I felt was my own material, a bit punk at the time, when I be honest. I mean, it was 1977, beginning of, there was no relationship to punk, but it was that thing. And then the first things I made after, the thing I've described about transforming from just finding stuff and arranging it and then making the new. So there are all sorts of little steps up, which been very, very important to me in the working process. Yeah, whatever that was.
There are artists like Donald Judd, Michael Heiser, Anselm Kiefer that have created these destinations, these compounds that will provide a legacy for their vision. I'm wondering if your sculpture park, if you envision that being the same, is that something that will provide a home for your legacy?
Well, I don't know about my legacy. It sounds a bit grand, but it would be practically a good place for me to put some of the work I've made that I don't want to sell and would like to see kept as a group of things. But it's also much more. I mean, in the park at the moment, there's more work from other artists than there are for myself. I mean, initially there were more of mine, but because that's all I had. I didn't have the means to But over the years, we've accumulated quite a lot of work from other sculptors. But I think the point is, to be honest, I'm just a sculpture buff. I love sculpture. I not just mine. I can't make it all myself. I'm always interested in what other people are doing. I don't, I mean, I look at the things and it's a long, long way away from me. Artists that like, I'm not sure I like or dislike or whatever. I don't really have, but I see it and I think, wow, it sounds a bit corny, but you just see the world through somebody else's eyes and brain. I mean, to see what they do. I think it's fascinating. So I hope the sculpture park does more of that than turn into a kind of just a Tony Cragg world. Yeah.
Sure. I've heard you speak about the jobs you had before art school, whether that was working with test tubes in a lab or at a foundry, casting engine blocks, or cutting away at stone in the basement of a bank building in London. And I find it ironic or odd that, each one of those, I feel like we can see reflections of those jobs in your work decades later. Is that just serendipity, or is it something where it gets embedded in your DNA and, these things just kind of...
I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, I love working. I do. Even it sounds crazy, but working in the foundry, I love doing it. Just like, moving my body, making stuff. I love to see material change. I'm also sounds shouldn't say this as an English person, but I'll do the garden. I mean, I'm happy to dig the garden. I'm because I just like to sort of see the material moving around and doing stuff. So it does. It's maybe just a habit I have. I'm a fidgety, nervous person, so I don't. My hands won't stay still. I always, everybody complains I can't even watch television without drawing or writing something. So it's always, it's just a little part. It's just part of my makeup. I can't give any answers about that really.
One last thing I wanted to be sure to ask you about, Tony, and that's an exhibit you have up now at the Kunstpalast in Dusseldorf called Please Touch. Can you kind of tell us what the origins of that exhibit are and what you hope to provide to viewers as an experience? Because it's a little bit counter to the usual sculpture exhibit, right?
No, it is very much so. I mean, I think that is, I mean, we all know for all sorts of reasons that if as long as the material's in my hands and I'm changing it, I feel all right about it. But as soon as it comes into somebody else's hands, they will change it, and that's probably not in my intention. So we all understand when you go into a museum that you don't touch the artwork. But on the other hand, I did quite a few exhibitions. Dusseldorf is a little bit of a home game. People know my work, and they either like it, dislike it, whatever it is. But I mean, I'm part of a kind of dialogue, discourse on art, on sculpture here in the area. And so we just wanted a different facet of that, and I had the work. I couldn't borrow it from anybody. So we had to have it out of the foundation, out of the studio. And I had this group of 20, 30 very substantial works, which you can't really do too much to. I mean, I'm surprised how little has happened to them, to be honest. I mean, so I was actually there yesterday, and somebody asked me to give them a little bit of a tour, which I did. And I could see what people were doing to the work. And, and it's very strange because people, when you touch stuff to find out the texture, you touch with your fingertips. You touch like this. If you want to experience the form, then you touch it with the palm of your hand. And the third category of touching is like this. You grab, you grasp, and I really think I could see people. I mean, I know some people don't have great eyesight, and maybe the haptic is more important to them. But what I really realized, other than sort of stroking the sculpture, was a little bit weird. I think the fact that you can if I reach out and just touch you now, it's a very strange. It changes our relationship. It's a it's a change of status. And I think this change of status is really what counts. It's it puts the thing on a very different and quite a real level for people. It's not all about the haptic. It's about grasping things, and I think so. I'm quite happy to see that. And there've been a couple of silly events. There's always some silly person that wants to do, be participatory and do something silly. But I mean, most of the time, it's been very, very understandable. That's fine. So, and the thing is, I have to say, it was just an aside. Is we planned this exhibition 2 years ago, and it was really just after in the process of installing the exhibition, and somebody came. Heinz Mack, the sculptor, German sculptor, called up to say, "Hi, Tony. I mean, just by the way, Heinz Mack is almost, I think, 90 something, whatever he is. So he was around in 1954." And he said, "Oh, by the way, in 1954, there was an exhibition of Henry Moore in the same building. And in two of the rooms, there were signs, 'Please touch the sculptures.'"
Oh, wow.
So we're kind of, well, that's maybe serendipity. That's that you kind of end up at the same solutions and things. That's a nice thing. I like that. There's some continuity there, which we hadn't figured on. Yeah.
Sure.
But we won't be doing it too much. I don't think it's a pattern of a model for the future. It's too much risk involved.
No, but it reminds me how I've noticed how an art handler or a curator will handle a piece of art versus that same artist who is reunited with a piece they made 15, 20 years earlier. They feel, empowered to go grab it, touch it, and, be more hands-on with it in a way that a handler or a curator never would. It's like they still feel like they have the agency to handle their work in a way that nobody else would.
Yeah, indeed. And that's why, I don't know if you know this, but in the Tate Gallery, there is a bylaw that the artists, under no circumstances, can touch their work that's in the collection. Mm-hmm. Because the reason for that is that Turner used to arrive very early in the morning with a ladder and step up onto his painting because he felt he ought to just change. He wasn't quite happy with it, even if it was 20 years old, and he was just doing a little bit of improvements so the painting was continually changing. And they said, no, we can't have that. So they made a law: artists are not allowed to even touch their work. So we're not at that stage yet, but
I've heard similar stories about Bonnard, that he would carry around a small tin of paints in his breast pocket, and whenever he'd go to someone's home for dinner that had one of his paintings, he would sneak off during a meal course to apply touch-ups.
Well, that probably meant he didn't get invited very often. So,
well, Tony, I really appreciate your time today. I'm a huge admirer of your work. I encourage anyone to see your work, whether that's, again, the new exhibit coming up at Marion Goodman in LA that starts April 27th. Tony, I can't thank you enough for opening up and being willing to engage in a dialogue with me today.
It's been a pleasure. It really has. Okay. Thanks so much for that.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.